Good morning. Welcome to Not Sure This Matters. We are still man down by one, but we got the suits and the fish present. We're doing a little different style today. We're doing a little remote on a riverside chat with our lovely Marcus, who's our producer, editor, and everything else behind the scenes.
One
So
man
once
band over
again,
there.
huh?
He's a one man band over there.
The one man band taking care of business. So, there's been a lot of topics coming up in health, fitness, exercise, nutrition world, and it's a constant. It's a big social media content thing. It's a big news outlet kind of informational sessions. Every other thing you see on TV is pharmaceutically driven, medically driven, this and that, and GLP-1s, and so many different topics to talk about. So I think, as this podcast / discussion seminar information session as they go, we are discussing those topics. And our whole goal is to try to weed through things that are useless, things that are useful, and then the gray area where it's like it could be useful for some people, useless for others, and help people decide what they need. So, I think one thing I'd like to start with and get your opinion on, Mike, is in terms of assessment of what to do for exercise, nutrition, medicine, or however you're approaching healthcare, what is your take on accountability to risk in terms of what you're willing to balance in terms of risk benefit? Any thoughts on that? I know it's a very vague
Yeah.
topic, but something that I think we could talk about.
Well, obviously we deal with risk no matter what. Like life is really about risk management, risk assessment, and then choosing the one that provides the most benefit to the risk or whatever that ratio looks like. Exercise is no different. There's obviously an inherent risk if you do something incorrectly, if you do too much, if you don't recover enough, like you can be exposed to different types of injuries and illnesses and problems if you don't do things correctly. We try to mitigate that risk. There's no way of eliminating risk. It's just like you can wear a seatbelt in the car and still get in a car accident and suffer an injury, right? So when we go through our evaluation process with a new client, we try to make sure that we have a macro lens and then a micro lens. So for the sake of this conversation, a micro lens might be looking at someone's old shoulder injury. What are the things that would really provoke or insult that area in terms of exercise selection, exercise prescription, exercise sequence, parameters, things of that nature, so that we can get the most out of that shoulder without having at least a significant drawback. Right. So this is where we employ maybe different types of pressing work. So let's say a barbell bench press is really, injurious, but dumbbells at a slow tempo with high reps, low weight seem to do the job, right? So that is just one example of us minimizing the risk profile of a particular exercise for a particular individual. The macro level might be, okay, this person is 40 pounds overweight. So we can get into the whole maybe body comp, obesity, risk profile itself. So when we look at that being overweight for too long, we know there's plenty of things to consider. If we look at exercising, whether that's increasing cardiovascular, using resistance training, or any other type of modality, we know there is also inherent risk, but it looks a lot better.
Right.
We have this one over here, which is like continue to do what you do and be out of shape and overweight and maybe metabolically dysregulated, or we run the risk of you pulling a muscle at some point in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. So, and when we put them side by side, people are able to make an informed decision about what risk they want to deal with. And I think that's part of this conversation, whether it be on the exercise, the nutrition, or even the medical management side, is like you get to choose. You get to be an educated consumer in what risk profile you're willing to deal with. And then we can navigate that together with the feedback systems. And to your earlier point about the accountability. Because if we are both aware of this, then we can both manage it together.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, hey, go down to the, Planet Fitness down the street and figure it out. Because that probably has a greater risk. And I don't know if it's going to be as big as the risk of being, obese and metabolically dysregulated, but it still is a greater risk than working with a trained professional that's going to be customizing your programming, working alongside a doctor and a PA and all the people that you have on your staff to
Yeah.
make sure that we have a coordinated and concerted effort to make
Yeah.
sure that this person is going to get the best result possible.
Yeah, because I get a lot of what are the risks of the medical end of things?
Right.
And it's always interesting to me because, like, I'll be sitting in the office and there'll be someone across from me who's maybe in their 50s, terrible body composition, not a lot of energy, doesn't sleep well, not super happy. Sex life is terrible. Libido is terrible. Social interactions aren't the best. Drinking on the weekends, overeating. Clearly, they don't understand it, but their coping mechanisms are in place for something they might not even recognize as a problem, but they're like doing the weekend warrior type kind of remove your brain from reality session. And they're sitting there saying to me, like, what are the risks of what I will do? And sometimes I just plain out, I can't control my frontal lobe, I guess. And I just say, like, what do you mean the risk? Like, you're sitting in front of me in horrible condition mentally and physically. So, like, assuming any risk with any benefit, I think is way better than just staying where you are. And I think that risk aversion is a generalized thing that people want to do, right? Like, everybody's risk averse. You don't want some downside effect to it. But it's almost like business, right? Like, to acquire clients, you need to pay for marketing, you need to pay for advertising, you need to pay. So that's kind of your risk, right? You're wasting your money. And then your reward could be the return on consumers coming back. So, like, the risk in terms of medical is time, some money, and yeah, maybe a little less energy after a workout or something like that. But the benefit on the back end is significant. And risk is always interesting to me because, like, in terms of exercise world, when someone says, oh, you work out so much, you're going to hurt yourself. It's like, I don't really understand what that means. I mean, if I'm trying to run an ultra marathon, yeah, like, I could die, right? If I go 100 miles in 5 days, sure, that's an extreme. But truly, are there big risks involved with, like, lifting too much or over cardiovascular exercising or over endurance training? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and the whole thing about risk, I first started to think about, like, we know this from all types of studies done on how people evaluate risk. So losing something is way more insulting and dangerous from a perception standpoint than gaining something. So if you were to lose $10 or gain $10, people would over index on losing $10 rather than gaining $10.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you provide, like, hey, this is where you're at, this is what you're doing, this is what you could do, but the trade-off is what they know, they actually think of it as a loss. So if you said to someone, hey, let's not eat pizza every day, let's not drink beer every day, they're thinking about what they're losing rather than what they're gaining.
Yeah.
Because it is a little bit more it's harder for them to actually conceptualize their life that way.
Right.
And it's more in like dealing with abstraction rather than the absolute of losing the things that they're comfortable, familiar with, and
Yeah.
somewhat convenient for their lifestyle, right? So when we get into the exercise, like, most people are thinking of, like, oh shit, I got to wake up earlier. I can't stay up at night watching Netflix. So they're already auditing in their heads, like, what they're losing to do this next thing. And then they have to pay money. And then they have to change their habits. So, like, when we get to the exercise thing, it's like, well, where do you want to be? Because if you continue to do what you're doing, you're going to be farther away, and then we have to kind of paint that picture of, like, this is what your life is going to look like with a reasonable amount of certainty. Like, this is what your life's going to look like if you do these things for X amount of time. But we know, and here, like, we know what you're doing right now on a long enough timeline isn't great.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the exercise piece, like, I think it's a way of trying to elude responsibility of personal health and well-being.
Yeah. It's funny, a little off topic, but when people sign up with me, I have this like little running notebook that I write down to myself like a prediction. So I say, we'll stick with it for life, we'll stick with it for a day, we'll stick with it for a year, we'll stick with it for 3 months. And so far, I'm on the 14 people I've written something drastic down for. Four of them have like come true. One I was off by a bit, but like it's kind of interesting because you can almost predict people's risk aversion
Yeah.
in terms of what you just said, because in their mind, this is kind of where I wanted to see if we could tease this out, and it seems like it's happening. You said something really poignant with cost. And I think people look at taking $1 out of their pocket and spending it on healthcare, preventative, where they might not see like an instant result. Like if you go to a plastic surgeon, they do an eyebrow, it's going to look like that the minute you walk out. With us, you might look the same, but things on the inside metabolically are different. But in terms of taking $1 out and paying for that without that visual result instantly, I think people are super risk averse to that.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing because loss of money, loss of $1 to them is riskier than loss of time on the back end of their life, right? Because at the end of the day, no matter what, I don't care what anybody tells me, we can't run the experiment because you can't let somebody die, bring them back to life, treat them, and see how they change. But like we are buying people time, no matter what. It doesn't matter. Like people that are better body comp, lower body fat, metabolically more active, movement at the gym, conscious of their eating, conscious of their sleeping, conscious of biopsychosocial factors in their life, are going to have a better quality and live longer, right? This is in a generalization. There's outliers to everything, as we always say. But like that risk aversion to paying for it is incredible. Because I don't think people have yet to program in their mind that paying in a health insurance company a premium and paying your deductible every year doesn't do anything for your health. Like it just doesn't. Like your average PCP visit is doing nothing preventative. All they're doing is making sure something's not yet broken. And I make an analogy to the airline industry. Imagine if every time a plane landed, you just took a look at it and you're like, oh, that's great. And there was no deeper investigation done until an engine blew up in the air or you started leaking fuel on a flight or one of the hydraulics went out. And then you're like, oh, now we got to fix it. That's healthcare as it is right now. Healthcare as it should be, which is amazing to me because the healthcare industry loves to parallel themselves with the airline industry, but they do nothing the same. How healthcare should be driven is risk aversion by actually doing the 72-point checks that we do, the preventative care that we do, the data gathering that we do up front, the movement assessments so that you can get the most out of someone's shoulder without blowing their shoulder out. The labs, the DEXA, the RMR, the WAVY, all of these things that can help enhance the preventative end of medicine, that's healthcare. But waiting for something to break is not. So the risk aversion of paying for what we're offering is a really hard thing to get people to get over. But once they do, I think the benefits are profound, which kind of can lead into some of the stuff we do.
Yeah. I mean, just a quick note on that. I think psychologically, the people that are more willing to commit and literally buy in, they're almost taking the ownership of their health and they're willing to bet on themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's what is a huge differentiator in people that like whether they don't really commit and they have to go think about it, or they start and then they stop because they realize like when you commit to yourself, you bet on yourself,
yeah,
you're now solely responsible for the outcomes.
Yeah, it's you.
Yeah. Which this does do a nice job segueing into a question that I received about like why we do the testing that we do.
Yeah.
More so on the health side, but people were asking about like why do we have that certain battery of testing? And you track back to like what are your top four probably causes of death, and you look at cardiovascular disease, you look at cognitive decline, you certainly look at cancer risk and metabolic diseases, and it provides a good answer. I don't know if we've done a great job educating on those diagnostics.
Right.
So if you want to speak on how this relates to where the medical system kind of fails at treating chronic disease, because we have to give credit to where credit's due. The medical system does really good job at acute care,
Yeah, very good.
but we've almost gotten to the point where the healthcare system should be leaning more towards chronic disease management.
Yeah.
They haven't, but that's exactly why we have a proactive healthcare system. So, and any type of treatment has to start with the diagnostic. So, if you want to break down each of
Yeah,
those,
and I think also people like health insurance doesn't buy you health. Hospitals aren't for healthcare. Hospitals are the auto body shop after you've gotten in such a bad accident that your car needs to get completely redone and you leave it there for a month and then it comes
right?
out and you're like, oh, the car's fixed. That's that. Just for frame of reference. So the diagnostics that we really do it in our facility are labs, a DEXA, DEXA, an RMR, a resting metabolic rate, a wavy brain scan, WAVI, and a VO2 max. So starting with, and we've talked about it a bunch, but starting with the DEXA scan. So a DEXA scan is a low energy x-ray. You lay on a table and a machine goes over you a couple times. It takes about 6 to 8 minutes-ish for the study. And it tells us directly within a percentage or two of variability, body mass and body composition. Now, body composition is not just muscle and fat, it's bone and organ fat and organ tissue. And this machine will give us a reading of your body comp, right? So how much muscle mass do you have and how much fat? Now, the key to this is if you go to a hospital and get this done, it's a split second in time. Bang. Where we have the advantages with recurring customers and people that are bought in, we do these every 6 months. So if you go to a hospital and your bone density is a little bit off and it's a little bit worse than it should be for your age and you're in the 70th percentile, whatever, you're going to get a pat on the back and told you're doing great. But you don't know what it was 5 years ago. You don't know what it was a year ago. You don't know what it's going to be in 3 years. You just know at that split second. With us, if you have a percentage change over a 6 month period or a year or 2 years or whatever, we can start to track that data. And then we can reverse course, right? Like if you are getting osteopenic or porotic, which are soft or really soft bones, we can start to block the progression of that. We can start to do preventative care to make sure that we don't allow that to continue. So that set of data in terms of assessment of your body comp is a huge deal because you are what you eat, right? So that then gives us leverage on, well, we need to adjust your protein intakes or your fat intake or your exercise and your nutrition. There's so many variables to adjust based on just that piece of information. And bone density is a really understated thing in terms of healthcare. And we look at it as a structural component of your body, and that's it. People are just like, oh, my bones. Well, I haven't broken a bone in my whole life, or I broke one bone. It's never viewed as an organ. But your bone is a working, living, breathing thing. And I have a question for you, logically speaking. Your bones contain bone marrow. That's where cells are made. If your bones aren't so healthy, you think everything else going on in them is perfect? Now, I'm not driving this by data. There's no osteoporosis penia leading to bone marrow issues. I'm not saying that right now. But I'm using logic over science a little bit, which I think is what you got to do in medical world. If your bones aren't making themselves well, do you think they're performing the job they do really well? Probably not at 100%, right? Take it for what you want. Second study we do is the RMR, resting metabolic rate. I think we talked about it a couple discussions ago, if you took the average human, even somebody like you who's like incredible at macros, right? Spot on for fucking 20 years of your life. If you didn't weigh your food and you were just like, yeah, I'm going to try to gauge it, you'd be like 50% off almost on average, right? Even as good as you are at doing that. So imagine you take your normal individual or somebody who's never been involved in this world and you say to them, how many calories do you think you need a day to survive? They're going to have no fucking idea. I mean, the random person on the street barely knows that 2,100 calories-ish is about the average American intake, which is also an insane statement because there's no average American body. But the resting metabolic rate assessment we do can give you a specific caloric need, right? Void of protein, because protein's relatively insignificant in terms of your metabolic panel relative to fat and weight gain. But if we can assess how many carbs and how many grams of carbs and fat and how many grams of fat in total you need to survive day to day to maintain a weight, to gain weight, to lose weight, and stay metabolically active, that's a huge deal. So the RMR is a quick 30-minute assessment, and it can give us a huge amount of data to help you adjust body comp issues moving forward involved with exercise as well. The Wavy Brain Scan. So it's a helmet you put on, and it assesses electrical signals to your brain. It assesses the movement of signals inside your head too. So not conscious, right? So like, oh, I'm going to poke the screen. No, this is subconscious. How fast is your brain firing? Once again, this can be done randomly and give us a time zero assessment of somebody's brain function metabolically. Or if you do these over time and we start to see cognitive decline or the opposite, people improving, we can make adjustments on vitamins, minerals, nutrition, exercise, reading. Hey, you might need to do a crossword every 2 days, like stimulate your brain more. Or are you truly ADD? Or are you taking medications that might make you worse? Or are you taking medications that are working? And assessment of that. So the Wavy Brain Scan is a huge, huge deal in terms of cognitive function and ability. And then the VO2, which we've talked about quite a bit, but the VO2 max, in case people don't really get what it is, you put on a breathing apparatus that assesses how much fluid and water movement out of your breath, which algorithmically calculates your CO2 and your O2 demand. And essentially your body will use oxygen and breathe out oxygen and CO2. Well, eventually you get to the point where you breathe in oxygen and you're only really breathing out CO2 because your body's using all that oxygen. Now, this is not a measurement of cellular respiration. That's a totally different medical discussion. This is purely O2 in versus CO2 out. And when you hit the threshold where you are purely putting out CO2 and purely inspiring regular room air, you've reached your VO2, right? Where your oxygen consumption demand outweighs your production of CO2. And it's a really, really, really good assessment of cardiovascular health. Why? Your muscles are metabolically active. They are what are processing oxygen and turning it into CO2. The second thing is your heart needs to keep up with the demands of your body, right? So your heart's pumping, pushing blood through your lungs. That exchange is happening. How well can you do that to sustain activity at a high level? The better, the longer you live. That's it. It's simple as that, right? But the only way to get that data is to do that assessment. And the key to that assessment, once again, as we've noticed this trend, it's not a T0. You do one and done. You got to do a bunch. You do them over time. You see how much better shape you're getting in, how well your cardiovascular fitness is improving or deteriorating. And we've seen everything between really good and really bad on people that look like they should be really good or look like they should be really bad. But we've also seen a bunch on people that work out a ton and their VO2 max is terrible, right? So their programming is sometimes dictated by certain goals they want, right? So somebody who's just trying to gain weight, their VO2 may fluctuate. But the whole key to having data is we want to get that back up on the back end of that weight gain or muscle build or weight loss or whatever. So it helps us manipulate caloric intake and exercise programming based on cardiovascular fitness. And all of that data is preventative care. This is not for when you have a symptom, right? This is for trying to alleviate the onset of any symptom. So those pieces of data, when used properly, can help dictate medical care in terms of longevity planning, or exercise in terms of what they need to target in terms of improving their cardiovascular fitness. Because the whole key, as we know, to longevity and quality is muscle mass. It is what it is. And there's no better way to state it, because it is the most metabolically active organ on your body, are your muscles. So if people are worried about caloric consumption, muscle mass, and all these other, you have to have the muscle mass to chew through the calories. And without it, it doesn't really matter, right? Like you have to have muscles on your body. And I think the funny thing is we talked about this before, but we've never really wavered from a couple things. And that's one of them. That muscle mass is going to dictate everything. And clearly outliers too, like your bodybuilding Mr. Olympias, sure, they might overdo the muscle mass because that just adds strain to their heart. But somebody who's in a reasonable weight with a good VO2, with a good RMR, with a good wavy, with good lab work, and has more muscle mass, showing no signs of deleterious effects on it, without a doubt, these sets of data can improve our outcomes and result-driven protocols.
And I think it's important to note that each of those tests are basically unique vantage points looking at the same thing. And in this case, the individual's, health threats,
Yep.
right? And just as important as the diagnostic tools, subsequently, it is the execution of the interventions that are deemed appropriate to move the needle in one or more of those diagnostic tests, because we're going to retest those quarterly at some point.
Yeah.
Or 6 months out or 9 months out, correct? Right. So do you want to speak just a little bit on like the interventions that you see have been most beneficial to some of the clients and patients that you've worked with?
Yeah, so the DEXA is an amazing piece of material. Like, I gotta say, I think in terms of an addition to medical care, the DEXA scan is just, I think it's my favorite, right? Because there's no lying. You can't fudge the numbers. The data is there. You can't hide from it. And the data is really useful in terms of motivating factors to say to people, here's why. Here's what's happening, right? Because some people say, well, I don't eat a lot. I don't do this. I'm exercising, but if nothing's changing on that imaging study, then we're not getting the result of the effort put in, and something needs to change on the front end. But that's a really good marker on how, for me, I can know that I'm giving the right medical therapies, right? Because our muscle mass is going up, our fat mass is going down, or we're staying in a really good ratio, right? Because we don't want people with too low percentage body fat for extended periods of time. And bone density for menopausal women in specific, I'll use them as the example, it's been really nice to track. And we've had a lot of women, I've probably had 20 or more women now go from lower end of good or osteopenic, not parodic, into much higher levels of bone density. So it's a really useful piece of trackable information to adjust exercise in terms of resistance programming. People are doing too much just passive cardio and not resistance training, dietary intake, and then from the medical end, hormone replacement in terms of adjusting testosterone, estrogen, progesterone for women and men relative to bone density and muscle mass.
Well, I think you said something earlier when you were talking about if a bone is osteoporotic at one point, how is that impacting the actual role of the bone as it pertains to the rest of the body, right? And I think a lot of people consider these things independent, like, oh, my bone is this, my ligaments this, my heart is this.
Yeah.
Where really, if someone is actually osteoporotic, you have to consider what they're doing behaviorally exercise wise, cardiovascularly, nutritionally,
Yeah.
because to that point, it's just a symptom. And there's a reason why we call it the musculoskeletal system,
Yeah.
right? Is like if your bones are that low in terms of bone density, your muscles are probably compromised too, which means your heart health, your brain health is also diminishing,
Yeah.
right? So it's like we can't just pull one thing out and look at it independently without recognizing and acknowledging all the other things that are in play here.
Well, there was a thing I saw in the news a couple weeks ago about like the United States and its infrastructure, and I guess they're going around and assessing a lot of the bridges, and they're made out of metal and they're starting to rust, and the cement under the bridges is cracking and whatever. And everyone's up in arms, right? Like, we need to rebuild the bridges because it would be tragic if you were driving across the GW Bridge and it just went kabang, right? Because of a decrease in the metal and the rust and everything like that. But we have no problem walking around as humans like a little osteopenic or a little osteoporotic. No problem, right? And I was, like I've said before, I was told by an OBGYN, every 50 and 60-year-old postmenopausal woman's entitled to a touch of osteoporosis, right?
Yeah.
But if you use logic in a more in a kind of outweighing the science behind it, you need solid bone. Like, that is the foundation of your body, right? Like, your bones and your muscles are what hold you upright. And there's nothing worse than when those start to fade. So if your muscle mass is decreasing and your bones are getting soft, like, you don't have a long way to go. Like, that's it just, that's the facts. It's the data. So something like the DEXA scan, that we can act on it and actually prove to people, hey, look, because in regular medical world, you'll never have that done until you are symptomatic. But then it's too late. A woman I was speaking to went and saw her OBGYN, who got her a bone density study. And the bone density study showed a little bit of osteopenia, and it was almost osteoporotic. So she said, what should I do, Marco? And I said, well, either if you want to have me take care of you, great. If not, you got to go to your OB and be like, what are we going to do about this? Like, my bones are getting soft. So she's a little reluctant to come interact with me long term. So that's fine. She went and saw this other OB, and the OB said, well, you're not really to the point yet where we need to start treating. So now this woman's in her 50s, and she has a kid who's in college. So I said, sounds good. She's like, so we're going to wait. And I said, no problem. I said, how's your son doing at school? And she said, pretty good. I said, well, if he was like an A student, then he started getting like B's and he got a couple C's. He's not technically failing yet, but seems like the trend is going to failing. Like, would you advise him to go like see his advisor or maybe a TA and get a little help so that we don't keep going until we're failing and it's too late? She's like, what are you talking about? She didn't really get the parallel. And I was like, well, that's your body. You were born with an A, 99% of the population, right? Solid bones, muscles. You're born with full battery life. And you are slowly failing. But the doctor you saw, now that you have a grade that's a C, is like, yeah, we're going to wait till you are completely failing to treat this. Like, it makes no sense, right? But that's what we're fighting against. And the cool thing, what we can do with a DEXA is, if you're getting an A, great. Keep getting the A. Like, let's support the A with the help of people around you. Great. But the minute you start getting a B, we need to get that back to an A. And that's our whole goal. And I think we both share that same vision. Like, the minute something starts slipping, we need to act on it. Not when it's already down, or not when the ship is half full of water and sinking. Like, we got to get on it immediately. The minute there's a little breach in the wall of our armor, we got to fix it. Because maintenance, preventative care is such a big deal that it's I kind of don't really like the word preventative care. I wish we could just deem what we're doing called healthcare. Like, they should change the name. This is healthcare. The hospital is sick care, and like redefine those boundaries, because preventative care, a lot of people are stating like, oh, I don't need preventative care. I'm doing great. I feel great. But you're really not until you get investigated. Because I have people every day, just like you do, come in the gym. I lift a ton at my other gym. And then you put them through like a Cuban press, and they can't, 2.5 pounds, and they're just like back delt is shot, or they're doing great and I do a set of labs on them and they've been carnivore for 5 years and their bloods look terrible. So there's everything in between, but the preventative end of things and that DEXA scan can really help us, and our RMR and the VO2 really help us head off problems before they even show their face or even get rolling down the hill.
Yeah, and this is kind of